Hello, folks, and welcome to Let the Magic Circle Bleed, bridging the gap between role-playing games and reality. My name is Jessica Creane, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself before we go any further. I wear a lot of hats in my life. I'm a game designer. I make a lot of playable theater, so a lot of interactive theater that requires audience participation in order to move forward, and ideally never puts anybody on the spot so people actually feel good about participating. And I'm also a games educator. I teach game design at CUNY City Tech and Drexel University in Philadelphia. And I consider myself to be a chaotic good human, and I run a company called IKantKoan Plays, which is a deep cut philosophy pun. Have fun with that, or I'm sorry, take your pick. And just to give you a quick sense of the kind of work that I do, a lot of the game design work that I do centers around the things in life that we find most difficult to think about and talk about and shine a light on in our lives. Things like climate change and how we differentiate ourselves from others, and the fact that human beings are so much more alike than we are different, and also what love and intimacy looks like in our lives. And the playable theater that I make that puts people into community and storytelling environments together often centers around our experiences of chaos, the personal life philosophies that we hold dear, and what the future looks like, and how we can envision the future collectively in a way that feels good and isn't objectively terrifying all the time. Not to imply that that's ever where my brain is at. So just to give you, again, a quick sense of the way in which I make work, the performance work that I do, the games that I make, and the personal transformations that I care the most about come together in this space of plays, this space of interactive experiences that are narrative driven, deeply immersive, that invite people into a very specific environment where they can do a little bit of shedding of identity and a little bit of an enhancement of other aspects of our identity. And we'll talk about more about that throughout the talk. Highly interactive, and often contend with who we are now and who we want to be. So without further ado, today's talk is going to be focused on bleed and what is it good for. If you don't know what bleed is, don't worry, we're going to get there. But first, a quick pause. Now, for those of you who have not studied game history in depth, in video games, the pause button was brought to us in the 1970s by Jerry Lawson, and it allows us to feel as if we can move back and forth between multiple realities completely fluidly whenever we please, because a video game can be paused, and we can come back to it whenever. We have not, of course, figured out how to pause our real lives in order to enter into a video game or a tabletop game playing space and then come back to reality and have it just be the way that we left it. So we are always, 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 whether we want to be or not, we are ourselves. And time is moving forward, our bodies are moving forward, our minds are engaged. And so this bifurcation of self into game space and reality is something we're going to talk a little bit about today. But we are always, always us. And so that's a good place for us to start. There is something that you may have heard of called the magic circle. It's been a part of game design jargon for quite some time. It actually evolved from 1949, and so this idea of the magic circle has been around for quite a while and has gone through cycles of popularity and falling by the wayside. And so the basic idea is that what happens inside of a game stays inside of a game, that you can enter into a whole different social contract when you enter into a game space, and that the repercussions of the game aren't going to follow you outside of that space. For instance, if you are killing monsters in a game, you don't have to worry that they're going to follow you outside of the game and, follow you to work tomorrow and try and eat you on the way. If you're playing a first-person shooter and you kill somebody in a game, they're probably not going to come haunt your apartment. There are, however, some things that may haunt you about that experience. So the idea is, again, you can be someone inside of a game space, as you can see here, maybe even a violent person, whereas outside of the game space, you are a total lover as a human. And so this is the idea of the magic circle. There is a differentiation between games and reality. Bleed begins to toss that idea out the window. It says that there is a permeable membrane between game spaces and our identities and who we are in life. And this idea that you can play a barbarian inside of a game and you can be doing it to explore your own pacifism. It doesn't mean that you are becoming a barbarian when you enter into a game space. It can actually just be a deeper exploration of and a testing of assumptions of one's own pacifism. Can you really put it to the test and see how you would feel in these very specific instances where violence might be necessary, for instance? And so bleed is the permeability between in-game spaces and out-of-game spaces. And I think it draws a really nice parallel, if you want to remember way back to biology when we were all in grade school, to cell membranes. Cell membranes let some things through between the cell and its outside environment and not others. And the magic circle, like a cell membrane, contains this really rich structured internal environment that can be really, really exciting and have a very specific goal, often, keeping humans alive with its very specific cell duties. And that is different from the cells on either side of it. But the space is very permeable. So as you can see here, we have carrier proteins, for those who remember, again, your old school biology, that allow some things to pass through the membrane from side to side. And in the same way, players can pass through game spaces inside of a game and outside of a game, and they can do so freely, often, but not always. One of my favorite philosophers, game philosophers, James P. Carr, says that it is an invariable principle of all play that whoever plays, plays freely. Whoever must play, cannot play. So one of the things that moves freely between in-game spaces and out-of-game spaces is our free will and our agency. Some things don't follow us so easily. My to-do list probably isn't going to follow me into the game. Just because I have to do laundry doesn't mean that my character has to do laundry, and vice versa. There is something in particular that flows quite nicely between these spaces, and that is emotions. Emotions move in and out of game spaces pretty readily because emotions live in our bodies, much more so than we often care to admit. And so Lizzie Stark in Leaving Mundania divided bleed into these two kinds of bleed. There's bleed in, which is when our out of game emotions impact our characters' actions in game. You have probably, if you are at all familiar with role playing games, at some point in time played with a friend who came in angry one day and for some reason their character was angry too. Or somebody fell in love in real life and they came in and their barbarian character was all kinds of swoony. So that would be bleed in, outside emotions impacting characters' choices. And then there's bleed out, which is when characters leave a game space still experiencing the feelings that their character was experiencing. So maybe you had a really intense role-playing session in which you were playing a scene where you were contending with a parent who was on the brink of death, and you leave that space and call your mom just to say hi and let her know that you're thinking about her. That would be an example of bleed out. And there's one example that for those who aren't familiar with bleed, you've already probably experienced as well, and it is a space that recognizes bleed, which is the X card. So if you're entering into a game and you ever have a conversation of, I really don't want to talk about, I don't want to talk about the pandemic in this game. It's just too close to home. I deal with it all day, every day, and I don't want to play a game that's set in a pandemic space. Or I don't want to play a game with violently racist characters. Even if our world is dangerous, it's just not something that's going to make me feel good. I'm going to have a lot of bleed in that instance, and it's not going to feel good for me. And so there is this control of bleed that is sort of structured with an X card. Or I don't want to play in a fantasy world where I have to fight for my humanity, to fight to be recognized for my humanity. So if you've ever had those conversations at the beginning of a game, be it a tabletop role-playing game or even choosing a character for a video game, or even a tabletop game, this is an example of bleed. These are moments where we are recognizing that we as players experience bleed, that the game is in fact going to impact us, and we'd like to have a little bit of control over what that environment looks like and what kinds of circumstances we find ourselves in. So I'm going to talk us through just a couple of examples that have been pretty impactful in my life when it comes to understanding bleed. And the first is Undertale by Toby Fox. And the text on Toby Fox's website for Undertale, I think, is pretty solid. And this is about Undertale. He says, in this RPG, you don't have to kill anyone. Each enemy can be defeated non-violently. Dance with slime, pet a dog, whisper your favorite secret to a knight, or ignore this choice and rain destruction upon your foes. So it's always an option. Violence is an option, and pacifism is an option. When I started playing this game, lightest of spoilers here, my friends, I knew that I could do this in a pacifist fashion, and yet I still failed. It took less than 10 minutes for me to murder my mother in the game. I thought, I don't think the game has really started yet, so maybe I just have to do this one murder, and then the rest of it will be fine. Then I won't have to kill anybody. And that was not true. And the game remembered that I had killed my mother in the first 10 minutes of the game, that I had no patience and no faith in nonviolence to get me through the piece. It remembered the whole time, all the way up through the end of the game. So I was constantly confronted within the game of the choices that I had made. And that had a pretty deep impact on me. Every time I closed that game, I started thinking about whether or not I was too quick to panic. And is it really true that violence is never the answer? And that brought up all kinds of interesting philosophical questions for me. And it ended up sort of launching me into a study of pacifism. And it was because of the experience, the emotions that I felt in this game that allowed me to really feel the impact of this and sort of explore nonviolence in the rest of my life. So it is these emotions that travel freely between that game space. Even though the game is not real, my impatience and my inability to commit was real, and that was something that I had to contend with for myself. There is a second game called by Maddie Bryce called Eat, which I think is a phenomenal game. And I want to read just a couple of the rules for this game. The game begins on the third Monday of either August or January, both in reality and on the calendar. You start with a budget of $0 actual dollars. You have to spend one bath and beauty point in order to leave your real house every day. And you have to visit your university campus at least 3.5 miles away from your home for 6 hours every school day. In case you have not played this game, this is all about what it's like to be a student and to experience student debt and to have to live on a budget where you have almost no money and make it all the way through school and keep yourself alive. It takes place over the course of 6 months, and it's pretty intense. I haven't played this game. Despite not having played this game, I am experiencing bleed when it comes to this game because it constantly has me confronting every time I think about it with how much I value comfort and how that is probably too much that I value my own comfort, that I'm really not willing to engage in some very, very challenging things because I don't want to go through the discomfort of it. So even though I haven't played, I'm experiencing this bleed out of emotions just because the game exists and I know about it. So we're actually, as human beings, pretty sensitive to bleed. And then the third one that I want to talk about is a piece that I created myself, and this is called Chaos Theory, and it's very close to my heart. This is a playable theater piece where the audience comes for a talk on chaos theory. They enter into a physical space together. They get little name tags where they write down their name and they write down a particular expertise that they hold, usually something real. If someone were truly a mathematician, they could write mathematician. If they're really good at making pasta, they can say pastaologist. Whatever they're good at, the game recognizes, the gaming experience recognizes. And so they are playing themselves. It is their real name, it is a real expertise, but it is a highly focused version of that. So we're not saying that you are bringing absolutely everything about who you are to the table at all times in this experience. We're focusing you in on a particular expertise that you have. So there's a couple things that came out of this experience. One was that I made it in 2016 when the world was true chaos. The game took about a year to make, and so that was the impetus, was this feeling of chaos in the outside world and the fact that I, Jessica, didn't know how to contend with it. I didn't know what to do with it. And so as a game designer and a theater maker, I ended up channeling that energy into a game and creating a character who could handle chaos. And in the course of playing her, I found myself far better able to contend with my own experience and feelings of chaos in my life. And so this process of creating games around chaos and living in them in this character was this process of bleeding in, of taking these out of game emotions that had me feeling pretty out of control and using them to impact the character that I created and allowing me to live in that space. There's also an experience that participants had around bleed within this piece, which is that they engaged with what we call role-less role play, which is a term that I coined last year to sort of talk about this idea that what happens when we bring ourselves to the table rather than, say, a high fantasy character like a barbarian when we're not a barbarian in real life. And so this is what it looks like. We're still in this world of bleed, but you are playing a version of yourself. So again, this specialized version of yourself. And over the course of chaos theory, what we found was that folks would end up beginning to play as who they were, and by the end of the piece, they were playing as someone that they wanted to be more than the person that they currently were, but still within their grasp. So we actually had folks leave the experience and go get tattoos that they'd wanted for years, or call friends they hadn't talked to in a really long time for no good reason. A couple people shaved their heads. Two folks even booked a flight to Bali, a father and a daughter, during the show. And so there's this opening up of space here for us to say that this game space gets to impact us. The choices that I make as a participant and as someone who has come for this lecture on chaos theory will impact their lives down the line and outside of this space. So there is this bridge between the gaming experience that they are immersed in the moment and what their actual lives are going to look like when they leave the space. And so this is a space where I find facilitators and educators to be absolutely vital. So again, I teach game design. I run these playable theater experiences where I'm both a character and a facilitator most of the time. And so what I often find is that just having someone be in charge allows people who are experiencing something that might be a little bit scary to feel pretty at ease, to know that they're in good hands because there is someone watching out for them. They know that they're not just left to their own devices. It's not about them and the other players having to hash out really difficult things without any criteria. There's someone to turn to if things get really sticky. And so I think about the philosophical thought experiment Theseus's ship quite a bit when I'm thinking about facilitation. So for Theseus's ship, it's the idea that there is a ship that is in the harbor and it's brand new and it has brand new parts, all of the masts, all of the sails, all of the planks, everything is new. And then over the course of the next 10 years, as it goes off sailing the seas, everything gets replaced. A plank here, a mast there, a sail there. But by the end of that 10 years, everything is different. And the question that it brings up is it the same ship? Even though all of the parts are different, it has the same name, and the crew on board might even be the same, but the ship itself is completely different materials. And so, as a facilitator, I often think of myself as the person on shore watching the ship change over the course of 10 years. And my students are the ship, or my participants and audience members are the ship. And they're growing and changing, but it's often so subtle that they don't know that it's happening, or they can't quite name it for themselves, or they can't see that there's a splinter in a board that's about to, stab them in the foot, and they need someone to come and replace that board. So my job is to be able to spot those things for them as best I can and to guide them in the process of continual growth. So part of what I try to do is just notice them, to deeply notice them. Does anyone seem to be in pain or angst or discomfort? Is it an okay discomfort? Is it not an okay discomfort? And there's a lot of that comes from experience, but there are some certainly some clues to follow there as well. And then if I do notice that something is off, I'll talk to them about it. I will name their growth or their growth areas, or ask them how they're doing. And I'll show a couple of questions that I usually use for offboarding in a moment. And the other part of my job is to just keep people safe and make sure that there's an onboarding experience into something that is a little bit uncomfortable for them, and that there's an offboarding experience for that same event, so that they know, again, that they're being cared for on either end of their experience, not just in the middle. So the onboarding that I usually do, would be a whole other talk to really get into, would be to set expectations, so folks know what they're getting into and know at the very least that they're going to be experiencing some growth, and that they're going to be bringing their full selves to an experience, because that's what Bleed allows for, is that you are coming as you. And then if there's any safety procedures to talk about, then I'll make sure to talk about that with them. I've also come across something really beautiful lately, which is these zones bubbles, which is part of acceptance and commitment therapy. And so what I really love about this is that it gives a really simple framework for how we can grow into new spaces of gameplay without feeling like we have to leave all of ourselves behind, or we have to become entirely new people in order to grow. So over on the far left here, we have a comfort zone. And so the idea is that in order to grow, we need to leave our comfort zones. But that doesn't mean we have to leave them so far that we end up feeling lost or alone. And so in the middle of these two spaces of comfort zone and growth, we have the self-care bubble. So we want to make sure that people always feel that there's some safety for them, that they can always have a place to return to, that they're in good hands, that they're never going to be stretched past the breaking point, but that they are going to have some space to be able to explore something that is new for them. And so this is my offboarding, part of my offboarding for players. Mostly what I do is make sure that they have a space to decompress if it's heavy material, and that there is a space for communal and individual check-ins. Usually the individual check-ins are in that decompression space, and communal check-ins would be with the group, so that everyone can feel together and not feel like their growth is alone or weird, because if something happens, usually it's to more than one person. And that then they can talk about that growth, and it starts to feel embodied and communal. I usually ask them what emotions they experienced while playing a particular role in a role-playing game. I will often ask if they've experienced those emotions in an out-of-game space. Sometimes this is in community. Sometimes if it's really high emotional material, I might give it to them to take home and think about at their leisure. And I'll ask them what actions they took to respond to those feelings, both in both scenarios, both in-game and out-of-game. And if there are discrepancies between the two, that's where this really rich gap space exists. Why? Why are those things different? What was it about who you are in a role-playing space that had you thinking differently or feeling differently in order to behave differently? And then we can sort of see if there are some overlaps between the way that they want to be in the real world that they're not showing up in game, or the way that they are showing up in their game that they're not showing up for in their real lives. So in conclusion, the Magic Circle is a wonderful space. It's great to be able to differentiate between games and reality so we don't all get haunted, but it is also a highly permeable space. And we are always, always, always ourselves, even when we are playing games. And also that Bleed is nothing to be afraid of, that it allows us to change and transform in a space that is supportive and communal. And it is in fact why we play games, in order to change our lives. And the facilitators and educators can help bridge this space between our in-game identities and our out-of-game identities, and help us to foster a smoother path where we can be who we want to be in our lives and use games as training grounds. Thanks, folks.